Welcome everybody to this joint event between the Minnesota State Fiddlers Association and the Laura Ingalls Wilder Legacy and Resource Association. Research Association, sorry about that. We're going to be recording the presentation portion of today's event, but the recording will be stopped before the discussion begins. So that's to allow for an open and free conversation, but the discussion will be summarized and made available after the fact. I'm Cindy Wilson. I'm the author of The Beautiful Snow and We Suffered Much, that puts some context on the history of the Ingalls family, and I'm also the grant administrator for the Minnesota State Fiddlers Association. Thus why I was asked to do the introductions today and lead the conversation. A thank you to Fiddler Rob Ross, who is handling the technology part in the background today. And I am honored to introduce today's speakers. Mary Pat Cleven is the past president of the Minnesota State Fiddlers Association and a member of LIWLRA. Her talk, The Real Pause Fiddle, was presented at the 2019 Laurapalooza, as well as at the Upper Midwest Folk Fiddlers Fest. Mary Pat will be providing a brief presentation on the episode in Little Town on the Prairie, in which Pa performs in a black-faced minstrel band in DeSmet, Dakota Territory in the early 1880s, alongside historically grounded information about the actual presence of black-faced minstrelsy in DeSmet during that period. Then we'll have David Reese, who is a former director of the Bakken Museum in Minneapolis, where he served for 23 years. He and his wife Suzanne perform as the duo Bundle and Go, longtime mainstays in the Twin Cities traditional music community. Their work focuses on the multicultural ethnic roots of Celtic music and the ways it was creolized as it blended with African, indigenous, and other musical traditions in North America. As a member of the Minnesota State Fiddlers Association, David has researched and presented extensively on the history of black-faced minstrelsy. In this workshop, David will offer a deeper historical overview of blackface minstrelsy, including minstrel-era fiddle tunes that remain in circulation among traditional musicians today. And then when David finishes his talk, the recording will be stopped and we'll begin the open conversation and discussion portion. As we listen to Mary Pat and David, reflect on how we as musicians and storytellers present this history even when it is uncomfortable. How do we decide whether to continue playing this music that has minstrel era origins? And for those who interpret the Little House stories, how do we responsibly explain this material in context? And I'll repeat those questions when we begin the discussion portion, but for now, let's welcome Mary Pat and then David.
Hello, hello. It's so nice to see such a nice group here. And this has been a topic that we've been wanting to talk about for some time, and this has been a great opportunity to do this. I'm going to start out this session. Actually, I'm going to start out this session by sharing my PowerPoint. That's always a good idea, huh? There we go. Okay, slideshow. Come on. Slideshow. I'm having the same problem. Slideshow from the beginning. There we go. From the beginning. There we go. Okay. I don't know why it always has these little things. All right. So that's me, Mary Pat Cleveland. I think a number of you have seen me at Laura Palooza and certainly a Minnesota State Fiddlers Association. We're going to first start talking about our session with a specific story that appears in the Little House in the Prairie books involving Pa, who is the fiddler performing in blackface. I did want to start out by kind of catching up some of the fiddlers in our audience about Laura Ingalls. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote a basic autobiographical manuscript in the 1930s called Pioneer Girl. And here's the cover. Working with her accomplished writer, author, editor, and daughter Rose Lane, they then crafted 8 books from the basic manuscript of Laura's adventures as a pioneer in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota in the late 1800s. Now, some of these stories were accurate, some were not, and today we have the interesting challenge of uncovering the truth. So this is Rose Lane is on the left, and this is Laura Ingalls Wilder, Mrs. Wilder, on the right. So our story takes place in a little town on the prairie, and that's set in DeSmet, South Dakota, between 1881 and 1882. It features Laura and her pioneering family, her older sister Mary, her younger sisters Carrie and Grace, and her ma Caroline, and her fiddling dad Pa. The scene is the winter of 1882 when the newly developed town of DeSmet decides to hold weekly what they call literaries. And these are readings, discussions, speeches, musicals, whatever. And these are held by the townspeople at the schoolhouse. And it's basically entertainment and socialization for the town. So now, as I mentioned, Laura started out by writing an autobiographical manuscript, and so we often look there to see, check out the accuracy of some of these stories. So here's what she put in. This is all she put in her manuscript. She writes, there was a vaudeville sketch given by some men blacked up as Negro minstrels. They did a clog dance while they sang, and she gives the lyrics to "Oh, Talk About Your Mulligan Guards," one of the common minstrel tunes. This entertainment was the most memorable social event of the winter. At it, Gerald Fuller was a star performer. And all this Laura people know about Gerald. Gerald shows up a lot in these various stories, and so Gerald probably was there, and he probably was in the story that she writes about. So once her daughter Rose gets a hold of this story and they craft it for these books, this is how the story turns out. And this is the artwork done by Garth Williams for the second revision of the book. So here's how the story goes. We start as everybody is coming to the weekly literary. And so Laura talks a lot about how crowded it is and how excited everybody is and how they just pack they pack the schoolhouse with all these people who just can't wait to see what's going to happen. Then up the center aisle came marching 5 black-faced men in raggedy-taggedy uniforms. White circles were around their eyes, and their mouths were wide and red. Up onto the platform they marched. Then facing forward in a row, suddenly all advanced. Oh, talk about your Mulligan Guards. These darkies can't be beat. And they keep on going on with the lyrics to Mulligan Guards and start discussing, or explaining how that goes. The man in the middle was clog dancing. Back against the wall stood the 4 raggedy, black-faced men. One played a Jew's harp, one played a mouth organ, one kept the time with rattling bones, and one man clapped with hands and feet. The cheering started. It couldn't be stopped. Feet could not be kept still. The whole crowd was carried away by the pounding music, the grinning white-eyed faces, the wild dancing. There was no time to think. When the dancing stopped, the jokes began. The white-circled eyes rolled. The big red mouths blabbed questions and answers that were the funniest ever heard. Then there was music again and even wilder dancing. When the 5 darkies suddenly raced down the aisle and were gone, everyone was weak from excitement and laughing. It did not seem possible that the whole evening had gone. The famous minstrel shows in New York surely could not have been better than that minstrel show had been. she then kind of finishes up the story. They were just trying to figure out who all the townspeople were. They were trying to figure out who they were, and since Pa had a long beard, they were trying to figure out which one of these characters was Pa. They meet up with him at home, and it is revealed that he is supposedly blacked up his whiskers and hid them behind a tall collar. Now, when I read, I never really did think this ever happened. And author and researcher Pamela Smith Hill, in her book Too Good to Be Altogether Lost, agrees, or I should say, I agree with Pamela Smith Hill. But the newspaper accounts in the 1980s do have regular mentions of Black Cork minstrel or vaudeville shows taking place in or around DeSmet, South Dakota. They even have one that's mentioned over 4th of July that does include Gerald Fuller. So these things did happen, just not necessarily as it's written in the book. So for today's Laura fans, this story just kind of drops like this racist bomb in the middle of this book. This pioneer family just going around doing their pioneer things, and then all of a sudden there's this minstrel show. And so this is where we have a challenge of how do we handle that. So today, today's traditional musicians, and in particular fiddlers, have similar issues with popular tunes that have a troubling past. And you don't need to be a fiddler for very long before you are doing some research, you are looking up a website, or in my case, where I just purchased a tune book off the internet, and then you find this. And basically you've got this lovely book of fiddle tunes, and then you're like, yikes. So I equate it to like you have this lovely little garden, and all of a sudden you just ran across a thistle. So this is where we as musicians run into the same problem, that we think we're doing this like fun little thing, and then we're like, oops, and here we go. Here's our history. So this is where traditional fiddlers and storytellers who are doing historical stories like Laura Ingalls Wilder's have the same kind of an issue. So in order to have this conversation, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. David Rees, who's going to talk more about the actual history and background of the minstrelsy and give us a much better idea of the history, so we can then go on to our discussion of how do we handle these troubling histories.
Okay, thanks, Mary Pat. That was very interesting. And a couple of comments on what you just said, that Laura Ingalls Wilder described it as a vaudeville sketch. And vaudeville really is the successor to minstrelsy, and becomes more popular at the end of the century and into the 20th. So that was kind of interesting there as well. It's also important that there was dancing and jokes, and as well as the music. And so minstrelsy is this interesting combination of all of those and more. So very glad to be here. I'm going to take a moment here to see if I can get my slides going, and try to do some sharing here. You might see some weird stuff from my screen. Who knows what you'll see. Here we go. Okay, now let's see. Can you see that? Okay, great, terrific. Well, let's move on to the next slide. Well, let me comment on this slide first of all. You see the instrumentation there. With the Virginia minstrels, you've got the tambourine, the fiddle, the banjo, and the bones. And I think some of those other instruments that were shown at DeSmet were maybe later additions, the Jew's harp, the mouth harp, and the harmonica. I don't know exactly when those come in, but the other thing to notice about this picture is the contorted poses of the actors. And you remember that that phrase that Laura Ingalls Wilder used about the wild activity, and that was a characteristic of the minstrel shows. They were wild. They were just kind of nuts, and people were jumping around and leaping about all over the place. So here's a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Some of these things just very briefly, but first of all, some caveats. I want to talk about this concept of creolization that Cindy mentioned in her introduction. Just a reminder about the importance of the African diaspora and the influence on American music. How the minstrel shows got started out of these individual actors who were in circuses and medicine shows who were the first ones to start using blackface and creating these strange caricatures. And then the era of the actual bands, like the Virginia Minstrels that you just saw a moment ago, that started up in the 1840s. I think it's important to point out some of the actual black performers who were doing minstrelsy and actually forced to black up, which is just so incredibly ironic and weird. But they kind of paved the way for the introduction of black actors and talent into American entertainment. A few comments about minstrelsy in the Midwest, of some little bits and pieces that I picked up, and then trying to put this in some kind of perspective, which I think is best captured by this concept of love and theft. And then a little epilogue about black comedy that just popped up quite recently. So the caveats, my level of expertise is not huge. I have done work on the African-American influence on American music, particularly on Celtic music. And my wife, Suzanne, and I did some lectures about this, online lectures during COVID and so on, and on creolization. I think a tougher question is, what right do I have as a white person to speak on this very fraught subject? And some people might say I have no right, to speak about this. But I come to it as a student, and I'm sharing what I have learned as a student of the subject, and not trying to impose my perspective on it. It is a very cringy kind of thing, and we've already seen a little bit of that. And that I actually have the same slide, Mary Pat, in one of my slides, same image, the turkey and the straw. And there's just this is a very complex, contradictory history. There is a huge literature on minstrelsy and on blackface and on all different aspects of those topics. And I think it's very hard for any person to become an expert in all this vast literature. I've kind of sampled it, and I'm giving you what I've learned. On the left, you see some of those cringy images. That's Zip Coon, who was invented, as it were, by George W. Dixon. We'll talk about him in just a moment. So the other aspect of the research that I've done on fiddling is a topic that we call 10 Tunes to Rule Them All, a project that my wife and I have been working on. And the idea is that the music tunes, fiddle dance tunes, came over from the British Isles, and certain of those tunes became wildly popular in North America. And as they filtered through New England, up into Canada, out to the western prairies, all the way to the Yukon, and then down through the different river valleys and into the south and southwest and far west, the tunes changed, but certain tunes just kept going and going and going. Tunes like Miss McLeod's and Turkey in the Straw, which is a very popular tune from the minstrel tradition. And we're going my wife Suzanne and I are going to Aberdeen, Scotland this summer to give a paper on this topic at the North Atlantic Fiddle Convention, which has published a number of great books. We've never been to that conference before, but we're really looking forward to that conference, which has a lot of scholars who are also musicians, which is just a perfect combination in my opinion. So creolization. Creole has a certain specific meaning in Louisiana with the mixing of the races there that occurred, but it's also a term used more broadly by ethnomusicologists and others to refer to, in general, to cultural mixing. And I like to use this image of gumbo. It makes me so hungry every time I look at this image. But gumbo is a great example of a creolized type of food. It has all kinds of spices from different cultures, black, French, you name it. And it creates something new and something often very creative and wonderful. And so one way to look at this strange phenomenon of minstrelsy is as a form of creolization. And it's a type of creolization that is very fraught, as we've been talking about. But there are some creative, interesting aspects to it. And it also gave voice to African Americans as they sought to find their place on the American stage, as it were. So this is to remind everybody of the incredible richness of African culture that we stole by enslaving the people of Africa. But this, I think, was painted early 1800s by Thomas Bowditch, and it shows a yam custom celebration. And somewhere in here, it's rather hard to see. I don't know if you can see can you see my cursor? Is my cursor showing up? There are some, I have to look closely myself, there are some, definitely some percussion instruments and some gigantic horns. There's the horns right there. So they were playing music at this festival. I mean, very colorful, I'm sure that, the food was incredible as well. So there's this incredible culture that's being forcibly, imported to North America as well as to South America. Musically, it's just incredible how much of American music has been influenced by African music. And here's a long list of some of the elements. The beat, it's sort of trite to say that, the rhythm instruments have played a huge role, but there's a lot more than that. There's the syncopation, the polyrhythms, hand clapping. The call and response method of singing largely comes from the ring shout of the enslaved Africans. And aspects of the blues, such as blue notes and even hums, moans, grunts, and vocables. So I think when you look at the history of American music, you can say without too much discussion that American music is African music. I mean, but it's creolized, of course. It's been creolized and with many different elements coming into the mix, not just the African, but obviously the Celtic, some of the European ballroom music, indigenous music. I've done a lot of research on the Métis of the Canadian prairies and the northern American states, and that's a very interesting blend. But I think the more you study it, the more I have come to realize that American music is hugely influenced by African. And one reason is the instrumentation. And in the center here, you see an accounting player. So that's an ancestor of the banjo. On the left, you see a drawing by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who incidentally was the architect of the U.S. Capitol building. He was down in Congo Square, New Orleans in 1819, I believe it was, and observed some of these gigantic celebrations on Sundays that were held by the Africans there. And he observed this instrument, an early type of banjo with an incredible man carved onto the headstock there, and just this thunderous noise from the drums and amazing dancing. And then on the right, William Sidney Mount is one of my favorite painters. He lived on Long Island, New York, in the middle of the 19th century, and painted a number of African musicians. And this is one of them, one of my favorites, and just a beautiful portrait of a banjo. And the banjo is an African instrument. I think most people know that now, but that wasn't always so well known. That's the last 50 years of scholarship have delved into that a lot more. So the instrumentation has had a huge influence on minstrel music and other forms of American music. This shows, and I just love this painting. This is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, paintings of enslaved Africans dancing and playing a banjo-like instrument with a gourd, and then some sort of gourd percussion. And then these are said to be some kind of rattles that are sewed into scarves as well. And in the background, you see the plantation where they were enslaved. And there's one scholar who believes that the painter of this painting was the plantation owner. And he was clearly felt it was important enough to document, and was fascinated by it. Here's another one of my favorite early pictures. That previous one was from the 1780s. I don't think I mentioned that. This is later. This is the middle of the 1800s, from Lynchburg, Virginia, where some of my relatives lived. And you see the instrumentation here, the fiddle, the bones, the banjo, looks like a 5-string banjo there, and the dancing that's going on. And this is in the South, but you have to realize that people in the North didn't see this. This was not visible to them. There were slaves in the North, but a lot of this activity, musical and dancing activity of enslaved Africans was in the South. And so people in the North were very curious about that. So keep that in mind. And I mean, what part of it was the exoticism of the whole thing. I mean, including the instruments and bones. I'm not exactly sure what animal bones those were. Somebody can probably tell me. Pig bones or something. But how strange to use bones as a musical rhythm instrument. This is another painting by William Sidney Mount. And I think it's a very loving painting in the sense that he portrays this man in a very positive light. I mean, just showing the dynamism of the man in his music. Well, now to give a little kind of overview of the minstrel phenomenon. As I mentioned earlier, it began as white imitations of African American song and dance around the 1820s. Started with these individual performers, itinerant performers who traveled with circuses, or they may have been just performing on the stage themselves. And I'll talk about a couple of those in just a moment. But of course, they portrayed these Africans as caricatures and stereotypes, and all the awful things: lazy, superstitious, happy-go-lucky, unreliable, dancing darkies. There were different themes within different types of characters, but nevertheless, they were not portrayed in a positive way, as we saw William Sidney Mount did in his painting. And blackface. Blackface, I haven't done a lot of research into blackface itself. It has a prehistory before minstrelsy. It was done in Europe. It was done for various different kinds of plays. And I don't have a lot more to contribute about that, except that the blackface was obviously used in a way to exaggerate the physical characteristics of the black people. And it did incorporate some elements of African American folk music and song, and that people were just entranced with. And an interesting little sidelight is that there were a lot of Irish Americans who performed as minstrel performers. Dan Emmett is one of them, but the Irish were new immigrants to this country, and they were looking for jobs, and some of them ended up on the stage. So minstrelsy is an urban northern creation in general. And as I mentioned, people in the north really had relatively little exposure to black people, except in certain areas like 5 Points. Now that's an area in lower Manhattan, it's shown right here, where all these different immigrants, poor immigrants, including Italians as well as the Irish and African Americans, mixed together. And it was kind of crazy. It was a crime-ridden area. I mean, you can see this painting right here. This is the 5 Points, so named because of the streets all coming together. And it appears almost like there was some kind of riot going on here. I don't recall the specifics of this painting. And if you want to see a modern-day fictionalized portrait of this area, you can go back and watch the Gangs of New York film. And that's Leonardo DiCaprio right there. So I can't say how accurate that film is, but you get some sense of the intensity of this interaction of all these different kinds of people who are, engaged in all kinds of activities trying to make a buck and survive. And they found their entertainment in this area in a section called the Bowery, which is still there. There were dance halls. The Almac was a famous dance hall that was frequented by none other than Charles Dickens, who wrote about it in his Letters from America, I think might have been the name of the book. And he talks about some of these, the African dancers that he saw. And there were theaters as well as, this is where a lot of the minstrel shows began. I don't know why that showed up, but anyway. These began with kind of spontaneous dancing down on the docks of New York City. And the spontaneous dances by some of these Africans, such as William Henry Lane, who was known as Master Juba, and an Irish dancer named John Diamond, were kind of picked up on by promoters like the circus promoter, P.T. Barnum. He actually hired John Diamond, and they would stage contests between the black performer and the white performer, who here is shown in blackface. Now, what's really fascinating to me is that I got a chance to see this play at Theater La Teda back in 2018. It was a world premiere called 5 Points. And here we have, the Irish John Diamond and the black Master Juba engaged in this contest with this P.T. Barnum type figure in the middle. And I think it's important to remember that these white entrepreneurs played a huge role in how minstrelsy evolved. I'll have a little bit more to say about them later. They certainly exploited many of the black actors and kind of were responsible for distorting how it was all presented. So these were happening in 5 Points, and these types of dances were influenced some of the founders of minstrelsy, including Thomas Rice. Now, Thomas Rice reportedly learned how to do he created this character, Jim Crow, the famous Jim Crow that we know about from Jim Crow laws after the Civil War, and maybe some of them creeping into today as well. But he, it was like Mr. Bojangles, in the famous song. He saw this old black stable hand dancing and singing in raggedy clothes, and he was fascinated by it, and he copied it. And the story goes that he actually bought the raggedy clothes off of this man so that he would, be more authentic, And there was some concern for presenting authentic, in air quotes, authentic black culture, dance, music, clothing, humor, even as they were distorting it and caricaturizing it. But there's a famous tune called Genuine Negro Jig, and I believe that the Carolina Chocolate Drops named their first album by that after that song. So it's a strange kind of faux authenticity, but that was something that appealed to the audience. They felt like maybe they were getting, what black people were really like. And that's what they were told. So Jim Crow did this fantastic dance. There are a few YouTube videos of the dance, and the chorus went, "Wheel about, turn about, do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow." And Jim Crow, I think Crow refers to the blackness of the man, and so Jim Crow is kind of a nickname. I don't think anybody's quite sure where the name came from, but the crow part of it is kind of obvious. And somehow that became the name for these anti-black laws. So another one of these early individual minstrels was George Washington Dixon. Another one of these traveling actors, one of the originators of American minstrelsy, and he portrayed a character named Zip Coon in 1833 and wrote a song to go along with that. Dixon was more of a singer than a dancer, but quite a good singer apparently. Later was thrown in jail for libel when he became a journalist. But apparently it's based on a trickster, folk trickster, that name, known among the slaves. And he traveled broadly. You'll see that minstrelsy spread all over the place and was extremely popular in Europe and the UK and across the States, of course. So you've got these early guys portraying these characters, and then let's talk about Zip Coon first, the song. So it might have Irish roots. Chief O'Neill, who published a famous book on of Irish tunes, made all kinds of claims which are probably not true, that it's related to this jig or this song. It definitely is close to a tune called Natchez Under the Hill, and it's very clearly close to Turkey in the Straw. And there's my sheet music on the right, the same one that Mary Pat showed. And there's an older piece of sheet music as well. Sheet music started to sell really big in the latter half of the 1800s, and people bought it to play at home, mostly ladies who had pianos, and it was a proper thing for ladies to learn to play the piano. And so there was this huge market as pianos became more widespread in the middle class and upper middle class. I'm going to try something very hazardous now, which is to try to get out of this and play you a little bit of minstrel music, but I'm not quite ready yet. So next slide, I think. But here you see the lyrics. Old Zip Coon, he is a learned scholar. Okay, so Zip Coon was this dandy type character, which was one of the main characters of minstrelsy, who had affectations. You know, you might have been a servant of the white plantation owners, but he had pretensions of, you know, being white and or being a learned scholar. You know, how absurd, you know, that a black man could do that, or could even be president. I mean, that was referred to in some of these lyrics. And with kind of somewhat, I would say, nonsense type lyrics in the chorus, zip-a-doodin, doodin, doodin, zip-a-doodin day. And this is another version of the song, a man with a double chin who played with skill on a violin, but the only thing he could play was Old Zip Coon, and he drove all his friends crazy, and they drove him away. And the story goes on and on. Okay, yeah, the music will come in just a moment. Dan Emmett, I mentioned earlier as the founder of the Virginia Minstrels, who are shown again over here. I believe that's the Virginia Minstrels. So you can certainly see Daniel Emmett. I've shown you several slides of the Virginia Minstrels. And he is known as the first person to black up an entire band. So before we had these individuals, you know, Thomas Dixon and others, and who just performed as individuals, but he got a whole band together with, and you saw that band in that first slide I showed you with the banjo, the bones, the fiddle, and the tambourine, and the effect on audiences was just electrifying. People had never seen anything like this before, and it became an instant sensation. And there were, you know, many imitators that immediately appeared to try to cash in on this new phenomenon. And but it was just something like they'd never heard before. This combination, this wild combination of musical instruments and songs and tunes, and the humor, the dancing, very exotic. His most popular song was Old Dan Tucker. Sorry. Oh, let me go back. Old Dan Tucker, which he claimed to have written, very racist lyrics. Some of you probably know that album, The Seeger Tapes by Bruce Springsteen, and that has Old Dan Tucker on it, but we can talk about the issues involved with modern musicians covering songs of that nature. Emmett also claimed to be the composer of Dixie, but there were others who claimed that, including members of the Snowden family, who were the subject of an entire book with the clever title of Way Up North in Dixie, because they were from Ohio, from the same town where Dan Emmett grew up, And they claimed to have written Dixie. And they were a performing family. And you can't tell from this picture, but this is actually in the, there's just under the roof, there was a little platform, and they would get up there and perform. Anyway, it's a very interesting book. It's hard to say whether their claim is true or not. But there obviously was a lot of borrowing going on by white people from black people, and this could be an example of it. So I wanted to give you a little brief snapshot of the minstrel repertoire. And, you know, I think the first thing to remember is that most of these were songs. They were not tunes. So, you know, we fiddle players love fiddle tunes, and but most of these were songs, and a lot of these were, I'm not familiar with them being part of the old-time repertoire today. Some of them are. Boatman's Dance is clearly one of them. That's a good example. I'll play you a little bit of that. There were tunes in the minstrel shows. They often were at the very beginning of the show. It was kind of a 3-act show with a little introduction and where they played tunes. And this particular album was put together by 4 different people, including Robert Winans, who's a real scholar and has written a book on minstrelsy. And so he tried to represent a good sample of the tunes and songs that were played. You can see one song by Stephen Foster here. There's another song, Hard Times. That's not the Stephen Foster version, as I thought at first, but it's not. Miss Lucy Long apparently was one of the really popular ones. But this is where I am going to try to hit this. Let's see. How do I do this? Do I stop sharing first? I think I have to stop sharing and then come back again. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to come back. I'm going to start playing you some of this instrumental music, but let me get back into, let me start it up here. Can you hear that? That's Turkey in the Straw, of course. Here's Boatman's Dance, one of the songs.
fashion loose, and I cram me in the cannel booth and dance, bope and dance, oh dance, bope and dance, dance all night till broad daylight, and go home with the gals in the morning.
So that is a little taste of some of the music, and I assume you can see my slides again now, right? Yep, okay, you see the slides. It may be a little hard to appreciate, but that music was just revolutionary for its time. People went crazy over it. Now here's Stephen Foster. His music is very well known, became the core of the minstrel music. It was a little more respectable, but it still presented a very sanitized version of plantation life. And of course, here's some of his very famous songs. I used to like to play My Old Kentucky Home, sing it myself, but then the lyrics became a little problematic for me, and I stopped. As I mentioned, minstrelsy went all over the world. The Virginia Minstrels, Dan Emmett's band, went to the UK in the 1840s. They introduced all these strange instruments to people in Ireland and in England. Master Juba was over there. The Ethiopian Serenaders performed for the Queen of England, command performance. And then jumping to the 20th century, there was a popular BBC show in England that went on for 20 years. This black and white minstrel show, and reaching millions of people. They created a stage show version that toured Australia and New Zealand and was a sensation over there, and also was very popular in Canada. And some of you may remember that Justin Trudeau got nailed for appearing in blackface, not once but twice, when he was a young man. Now I'm going to kind of have to accelerate here because I think I'm starting to run out of time. But I do want to really point out that these white performers controlled what was going on, and that as the black performers, these white entrepreneurs, as the black performers began to appear after the Civil War, that they were forced to wear blackface, just like the white actors, and they were forced to present the same racial stereotypes. But some of them really stood out and became extremely popular, like Billy Kersans, who was the most popular comedian of his day. W.A. Mahara was a white entrepreneur who had a touring group that you see the poster on the right from around 1902, and he hired W.C. Handy, who became the father of the blues. So he got his start doing minstrel shows. He was the band director and the lead soloist. And they went all throughout the Midwest. James Bland is interesting because he was a composer. And he composed over 700 songs. I mean, some really famous ones there you see. He also did a command performance for Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales, and was the first black performer who started to actually get to publish his music. Now, out of those 700 songs, he maybe published 50 of them under his own name. Others were under, other names, I guess, to disguise the fact that it was a black composer. But some of these performers just became incredibly successful. Bert Williams is another. He was the first black person to take a lead role on the Broadway stage, and he's kind of segueing into this era of vaudeville. W.C. Fields had this very poignant comment about W.C. Fields worked with this guy. He said he was the funniest man I ever saw and the saddest man I ever saw. Well, this amazing phenomenon spread all over the place, including up the Mississippi River. And Mark Twain saw it when he was living in Hannibal, Missouri. Made a huge impression on him. And Dan Emmett, who we saw earlier, founder of the Virginia Minstrels, he brought his minstrel group to St. Paul in 1857 and 58. Now, why did he come to St. Paul? Well, we're not exactly sure, but John Heine is the one who told me about this, that Dan Emmett's brother was a lawyer and became the first Supreme Court justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And he apparently stayed with his brother and through the winter of 57-58, and they would do minstrel performances right here in St. Paul. Another popular minstrel group came out of Milwaukee, 1889 to 98, and went all over the Midwest. Now, there's an interesting story I can talk about later, maybe, but Menzo Waite was from a family, the Reuben Waite family, who emigrated from New York State to Racine in the 1840s. And they were all fiddlers and dancers. And they had dances outside of Racine, where their farm was. And there's a manuscript book of their tunes in the Racine Historical Society. And so Menzo Waite, one of those fiddlers, toured with the minstrel group for 10 years. Now, why do I have Bob Dylan up here? Well, one reason is that he claims to have seen one of the last Blackface minstrel shows at a country carnival in Hibbing. Not sure exactly when the date of that would be. Somebody could probably figure it out. And the other reason I'm showing Dylan is he had this album called Love and Theft. Now, this is the only Bob Dylan album that has the title of the album in quotes. Why does he have the title in quotes? Well, it's because he stole the title from a book by Eric Lott, a professor at NYU, I think it is, who published a book on a seminal book on minstrelsy in 1993. Major text. It really has dominated the field. And I'm going to I have one more slide after this, but just as a way to think about minstrelsy, I think this concept of love and theft is useful because it's not just a simple act of racism and mockery, but there's this dialectic or mix of these opposing forces. There's this quote-unquote love or desire and identification with black people that these northern audiences, initially northern audiences, later from all over, felt with black people. They were attracted to blackness, even as they felt opposed to it or looked down on it. They had a sexuality and an anti-authoritarian kind of attitude that was very attractive in some ways especially to these early middle class, working class audiences in 5 Points and places like that. But of course, it's also a form of theft or cultural appropriation, and was used to repress black people. So I'm going to conclude with this little epilogue that just last week, Jeff Bennett, anybody who watches PBS Evening News will know about Jeff Bennett. He's a great co-anchor, and he just published a book on black comedy. I guess he probably grew up watching some of these black comedy shows, and he traces it back to the minstrel shows of the 19th century. And he shows that, I haven't read the book, I haven't got my hands on it yet, it's just out, but that the minstrel show, after the Civil War at least, began to provide a place for black entertainers to express themselves, even within the restrictions of racial stereotypes and blackface. Eventually, the black minstrels, the African American minstrels, performed without blackface, but it took a while for that to happen. But they're on a kind of a continuum, because remember, a lot of what they provided was comedy. And so actors that are listed here, that many of you will be familiar with, are standing on the shoulders of these earlier minstrel actors, and gradually carved out a space for themselves in American entertainment. and have, in many cases, come to dominate it. Well, I'm going to leave it there, and I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome, but thank you very much, and I will stop sharing, and we'll proceed and let Cindy do her thing.
Thank you, David and Mary Pat. That was very interesting. I've not been exposed to a lot of that history, so it was very interesting.